Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone to this webinar to discuss the youth-led media evolution. I'm Sharanjeet Lail, and once again, great to have you all joining us from around the region for this. Now, we know that Southeast Asia has transformed in just a few short decades. Economic growth has lifted many out of poverty in the region, and a whole new generation has grown up without having experienced the struggles that their parents or their grandparents went through. It brings with it a new perspective. Youths now expect more than their parents did from their governments and the businesses that they patronize, as well as the media platforms that they engage with. Now, the pandemic of the last 2 years has transformed their lives even further. Youths are now learning to adapt. They must now learn to live and thrive in today's normal and the next. Well, in this webinar, we'll be discussing several key findings of the 2021 ASEAN Youth Survey by Redhill. The survey classified youths as anyone between the ages of 18 to 35. And it provides a snapshot view of their aspirations and concerns through the eyes of nearly 3,000 of them across 7 ASEAN nations. Now, the study, titled Overcoming Anxieties for a Brighter Tomorrow, analyses the roles of Southeast Asia's youth as key drivers of economic, cultural and socio-political change. Now, remember, we also do want to hear from all of you, so please put your questions in the chat function and I'll try to get to them at the end of this session if we have time. Now, I'd like to introduce our panel of experts within the media and communication sectors. First off, we have Sarah Tucker, the head of Asia Pacific for marketing at LinkedIn, Sureka Raghavan, the editor of Campaign Asia Pacific, Pranav Rastogi, the Managing Director of Redhill, Imran Arif, Director for Content and Research at Redhill, and P.N. Balji, the Media Consultant, Journalist, Author. Well, welcome to all of you. Well, first off, I'll start with a question where I'm really playing devil's advocate. Why do you think surveying youth is important? Why should we care about their concerns? And how is it relevant to what you do? Well, Sarah, let's start with you and LinkedIn's perspective as a social media firm that plays a big role in distributing news and information and wielding influence.
No problem. Thank you. And thanks so much for having me today. Look, it is a good question because we do have a wide variety of different types of members out there, but really, I think what I want to say here is today's topic is of particular interest to LinkedIn, because when we say that we're here to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful, we really mean all kinds of professionals. And this starts with our youth. The youth of today, particularly on the lower end of the range, they're the next wave of accountants, filmmakers, doctors, marketers, architects. In fact, we actually did some research which looked at the Gen Z population, and by 2025, they're going to make up 27% of our workforce. And then you look at the other end, and those are our rising leaders. So really actually understanding how they are relating to media is pretty vital for us as a platform, because we want to make sure that we're creating a community and a space that supports them in that journey and really does help them grow into successful professionals.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Sarah. Sureka, we can move on to you now. I mean, you run a publication that also wields influence within the marketing industry. So what role do you think youth should play in media today?
I think so. First of all, thank you, Sharanjeet, and I'm really happy to be here. I think youths play a big role. They are consumers of media, they are makers of media, and to some extent, they're also holding publishers accountable to create good content. Youths now, they expect due diligence, they expect ethics, they expect engaging content, and they also expect diversity of thought. And some of these aspects were not always historically top of mind among a lot of publishers. And that's why I think learning from youth and what they are specifically demanding for is important for publishers. And one of the misconceptions I think that some publications may have is that youth-friendly content should be, in some sense, dumbed down. And I think we underestimate the intelligence of youths and their ability to sort of connect any sort of piece of news to a larger issue. And that's definitely something I've been inspired by, consuming a lot of youth content. And actually, not to brag, but also based on the study that Redhill and PRCA ran, I actually do fit in the youth bracket just barely. So I hope that I'm qualified to also speak as a youth. But yeah, that's what I think.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Surik. I'm glad one of us is within that bracket. It's so important, isn't it? Now, Pranav, obviously you run Redhill, which conducted the survey. Why was this survey important to do, and whom exactly is it aimed at?
Sure. I'll start by just echoing Sarika's thought that I also do qualify as a youth. So when you asked about why it's important, well, I like to think my voice counts. So and it will for another 4 more years, at least by this international definition of youth. I think the second thing is that, look, in terms of our my day job and our day job, it's what we do. We advise brands, companies, governments, and people on how to engage with their target audience. And for many of them, this is a group that's extremely important for them, but it's also a group that does things and consumes media and engages with the news and with content very differently to how previous generations have done. And part of the reason is, social media platforms, part of the reason is technology, is the mobile phones and things like that. So it's a very different way of reaching out to this particular segment. It's very different to how we've typically done in the past and how the last 20 years media and sort of news and content has functioned. But I just want to maybe just say one thing about why I'm very personally invested in this. And I spent majority of my life as a youth in Southeast Asia. Majority of my friends are youths in Southeast Asia. Majority of my colleagues are youths in Southeast Asia. And these are topics that I'm very invested in, that I feel a sense of personal responsibility towards. And this is especially true when we talk about, freedom of speech or social media moderation or, content moderation on social media platforms, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But going back to the second question that you had asked, I think one of the key things is that the youth in this region are increasingly getting all their news and information from online platforms and from social media. I think in some markets in Southeast Asia, it's almost 95% of them are getting it from online content. And I think that's why it's important to really understand and discuss how are we doing things on social platforms. Is the way that we're currently putting out news for this generation, is that the right way to do it? Are they taking in the right information? Are their voices being heard? Do they have the right platforms to communicate those voices? And that's why, I think it's really important for us to first capture those voices and then have discussions on what they are, what's important for them, and then use that to inform policy and, for the right stakeholders to use that information to inform, all the actions that they're doing beyond that.
Thank you, Pranav. And indeed, we'll be hearing a lot more about some of those incredible statistics that were collated from those 3,000 youth that were surveyed all across the region. In fact, Imran, it was you who collated a lot of those statistics and information in the survey. So what are some of the big standouts for you, and why does it matter?
Thanks, Charanjit, and thank you for having us here again today. So just to echo what Pranav said, I do also fall into the bracket. So when we actually conducted this survey, the first survey back in 2019, I really thought about the kind of questions that we would like to have asked. So just a bit of like how certain government political parties across the region, they do have certain youth-oriented wings. And to be honest, all of them, have a minimum age of 40 years old, which is actually away from the international standard of how we categorize youth. So when we wanted to kind of like devise a survey with the questions, with the insights, we wanted to actually see like what were the plenty questions that I would like to be asked and what would my peers like to be asked. So when we actually conducted the survey for this year, after having 2 years of pandemic, just looking ahead to how it would be in the next normal, we just saw that one of the things that has especially exploded over the past year, that's accelerated over the past decade, was that online activity has been an integral part of the lives of the youth. So when we conduct this survey, providing a snapshot of the region, we also want to look at what's already been said in other areas as well. And what we found striking was that according to the Digital 2021 report by We Are Social and Hootsuite, they're about, youth spend nearly about a third of their lives, about 60% of their waking lives online. And much of this activity has been most evident on digital channel use and social media use. So just a bit on that. Many secondary high school leavers are around the same age as Facebook, having been started in 2005. So that highlights that the younger percentile of the youth in the region, according to our service metrics, have grown up in a very and highly digitalized world. So although many of the youth don't actually use Facebook now, moving on to platforms such as TikTok and such, this phenomenon highlights that those digital interactions are more normalized than previous generations. And we are entering somewhat new territory, uncharted territory. And it's kind of interesting to see how the youth engage in online channels in the next normal.
Thank you, Imran. Yes, I was particularly struck by that in the survey as well, the fact that most teenagers now are about the same age as Facebook, and they've grown up in this very digitalized world, haven't they? And of course, this is something we'll be talking about further as well. Now, moving on to you, Balji, as a veteran journalist, you've run publications in the past. You've also taught students at the NTU School of Communications. In your long experience in the industry, what role has the youth played in media, and how is it changing today? Balji, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes, we can hear you. Fantastic.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. Yeah,
go ahead.
I feel kind of out of place because I must be the oldest person in this panel. I'm now 73, I think. Not sure yet, but I think I'm 73. But I'm very interested in the youth because I'm a great consumer of news. And sometimes when I read the news reports and the way they are written, in most places, especially in newspapers, and when I watch TV, I'm not sure whether the youth understand what is being said. Partly because they don't have, they don't really have a sense of history. And secondly, that the language used is not cool. The word that most youths use now is not cool for them. And so engaging with the youth has always been my passion, I believe. And I'm a grandfather to two grandsons, who are two young grandsons, and the way they talk, the way they behave, make me wonder whether there is this so-called youth revolution that is happening, that is simmering, but do we know what that revolution is all about? I'll stop here.
Yes, and hopefully that's a revolution that we'll try to unmask during this session. I guess, let me follow up with another question, which is really, have youths always been playing an influential role in the media's evolution, or has it been vice versa? Has, as one of you said, has the media had to dumb down in order to appeal to them? And what sort of role do you think you see youth in Southeast Asia in particular having in trying to set the future direction of the media's evolution? Anyone can jump in here with the answer to this.
I can jump in first. I think Imran sort of spoke to it earlier. The short answer is absolutely. And I would say it's not necessarily, it's hard to say who came first and whether it was chicken or egg in that respect, but absolutely they have an influential role. In fact, I would almost say that the attention span and the mass of content available to the youth today versus perhaps the generation prior to them has meant that formats such as stories and TikTok and Snapchat have been developed to be quick and effective means to communicate. And you're also seeing that within not just sort of some of those more personal communication methods, but also from, I guess, a more professional sense of, you're now getting 5-minute talks with, etc. You're having bite-sized pieces of content. It's certainly, I think, changing the way that we're consuming our content, because we're a lot more fast-paced. There's so much more out there, and that's a result of that digital acceleration.
Thanks. Very good point, Sarah. Anyone else want to echo that?
Also, I'll jump in. I think one aspect, I think, the way youths influence the way media is run, I think, is creativity of content. I think I'm personally inspired by the creativity levels of youths. I feel like there's so much that media can learn from them in that regard. Another thing is I'm also inspired by the way I think youths tend to challenge a lot of systemic issues, whether they're social injustices, institutional issues. I regard youth voices as to be more bold, to be more brave, and they're not a group that would simply sort of sit down and accept the status quo. And that's something I definitely appreciate in terms of content.
No, it's a very good point, Sureka. Anyone else willing to jump in here?
Yeah, I think that the last point is really important, because I think I see two sides of this argument. Earlier I mentioned that in some countries there are about 90+% of respondents who say they get their news predominantly from social media, and if you compare it with TV news, sorry Sharon, I know you spent a career in TV, but 6% in Singapore said that they got their news from TV news, and for print it was 10%. So I think that whole point about how they're really driving media companies to push the boundaries and how they engage with them on experimenting with different forms of content, all of that is really great. And I think the other point about and that Sureka mentioned about that the youth really are empowered to share their voices and to take a stand and to use social platforms and use digital platforms to amplify that voice. I think that's really important. That's enabled this generation to do that in a way that it hasn't really sort of happened in the past. But I think on the flip side, and this is kind of where I'll play the sort of the negative role, is that I think there's also a ton of disinformation online. I think for one of the studies, the statistics show that only about 71% of people thought that they could distinguish between fact and fiction online. So almost a third could not. And when you're young, you are being bombarded with news from all angles, things that could be deliberately misleading and false. I think it's very, it kind of shapes your impression and shapes your beliefs and views when you're given so much different type of perspective and views from different angles, even though some may be deliberately fake. So I think that's something that we really have to be careful about. We've seen, especially through Frances Haugen's testimony, we've seen a lot of these like the insights of how some of these social media companies work. And we've seen examples of how in Myanmar, Facebook was breaching its own policies and promoting content that incited or glorified violence or hate speech. So that's something we really have to be careful about. While they're really empowered to take a stand and to amplify that stand, we have to make sure that they are also accessing content that is I'm going to say correct. I'm not going to say whose perspective it's correct from, because that's a separate discussion, but let's just say content that is truthful. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and in fact, that's a really good point. And fake news is something that we're going to get into very shortly as well. And at this point, I'd love to hear from all of you who have joined us and are listening in. Remember, please put your questions in the chat. We'd love to get to some of your questions at the end of the session. And, it is such a good point you brought up, Pranav, that the youth are now defining the kind of channels that they're getting their news and information from. And you're absolutely right. TV news is pretty much had its day when it comes to the youth audience. It's a medium that really only appeals to the much older demographic now. So, Imran, I'm conscious of the fact that you've got a lot of that statistics and information on you as well. So give us some of the highlights of that. How are the youth actually defining these new channels and ways that they get information?
I'm happy to share a bit more statistics on that. So based on the survey that we've done across the member nations, so we saw that, as Pranav mentioned, there hasn't been an overwhelming majority of youth consuming news and on knowledge on current events through social media. So ranging between 70%, 71%. So that'll be one of the lowest to up to 96% of respondents who use social media for this purpose, as opposed to other media sources such as print news, as we mentioned, TV and radio. So what we saw in this is that no matter which country that you're looking at, is that is at the base level, a high level, that the preference is towards digital channels. And it's not just on what they consume, but just depending on how many hours actually spent online, or where are the eyeballs at throughout most of the day. So we saw the preference for these sort of platforms, digital platforms, reflecting the hours they spent. So across all the countries that we surveyed, the youth spend nearly about 5 to 10 hours a day on the platform. So when you think about it, we may not think that's a lot, but when you think about how the morning has run until the night, so that's quite a lot of your waking hours actually spent looking at those digital channels. And I just want to kind of echo what Pranav meant about disinformation as well. I think one of the things that we must be wary of, very cognizant of, is that when we speak about fake news, fake is now relative. Truth is very much relative right now. I mean, one of the things that we're talking about is that we're living in a somewhat post-truth world, and this is how, when we look at how algorithms are constructed nowadays and how we kind of delve into echo chambers. Of course, that's not just specific to use, but it might be a bigger thing that we have to kind of track moving forward. So at this point, the media, how they operate, whether it's more conventional means, but now on the digital front, they still pretty much represent the fourth estate of democratic power. So in exercising capacity to kind of frame and advocate for certain important issues to the public as well. So, on the onset, we always think about the media having that responsibility, that innate kind of that responsibility to deliver and filter news with the highest accuracy possible. But, this is the ideal, but unfortunately, that's not always the case. There are always limits to how much accurate information that people and even organizations are privy to. So while the owners were placing the responsibility on the media and the communications professionals, we must also think of the role about the people consuming the news themselves. And this is where the importance of critical thinking needs to be talked about. So when we're consuming the news, do we think about the vested interests behind them, the media organizations behind them, who's bankrolling certain kind of angles behind that? So when we think about that, we have to think about how that relates to how certain decisions are made to put the news out there and how it's actually filtered through. But not everyone filters information critically in the same manner. So it's a habit that we feel that must be adopted throughout one's life, and it's not dependent on just the consumers and the media themselves. We have to think about the social structures, the educational structures, and even familial structures in how they kind of shape this perceptions and ability to think critically. So if we can see how we can improve this, we can kind of address the sort of catch-22 situation of how do we limit, how do we impose censorship, but not limiting freedom of expressions as well, because we have the ability to kind of filter the news at a certain level. So there'll always be issues framed to advocate certain agendas, but the media and communications professionals should not necessarily act as guardians of information, because getting into this will create a certain slippery slope, because at the end of the day, who will guard the guardians?
Yeah. No, you've brought up many good points there, Imran. In fact, you've anticipated a lot of the conversation that we're about to have. But before I go on to the next question, where we will look a little bit more closely at this notion of fake news, Balji, do you have any points here about how the media kind of molding this next generation of how news is being reported?
First, let me say that it is a dangerous prospect to start talking about how media should mold the younger readers. I think that that's something that many media organizations don't have the capacity or the capability to do that. They are into a phase, a very difficult phase, maybe a dangerous phase of trying to make themselves, they want to survive. We want to survive, then is it the youth, the audience that you're going for? Are they the people who are the young audience? So I think that is one critical question. Secondly, I think it maybe it is a bit more relevant. The media should not be given the sole responsibility of communicating with the youth. I think the as I said earlier, they maybe some of them don't have the skills. Maybe some of them are into trying to make their media organizations survive. So I think we should start looking at other possibilities. And what do I mean by other possibilities? I mean the first possibility that comes to my mind is family. How does family get organized in such a way that they can communicate with their children, their grandchildren, whoever, and the word that I'm going to use is relevance. How to make the news relevant to the younger people. I mean, that's a whole topic by itself. So I will leave it for a later stage.
Thanks for that, Balaji. That's a very good point, how to make it relevant to the youth, make it interesting to them as well. But I wanted to go into this point that we've started talking about, which is this notion of fake news and, who regulates it. And Imran, it's really interesting to hear about your statistics because, you mentioned that youth now spend nearly a third of their waking lives online. And much of this activity is most evident on social media, as we've been talking about. So no surprise that many youths prefer to consume news on social media. They want safer online spaces, and particularly when it comes to guarding against fake news, which we've been talking about, and online harassment, which is another big worry as well. So what are your thoughts on this? And Sarah, I know we've been talking a lot about social media, and you're the only representative here really from that sort of area and that industry. So give us your thoughts on this.
Sure. I mean, look, I'd probably start by saying it's about the platform having the right mechanisms in place to create that safe space. It's about the platform having the policies, the guardrails to ensure that the people that are on their platform using that platform feel safe because action would be taken, for example, should something be done that is inappropriate for whatever reason that may be. But also, most importantly, their privacy is also respected on these platforms as well. I think another thing to think about here is what is the tone of your media platform? What is the space that you're creating? Are you creating a place for people to have positive conversations or negative conversations? Are you looking for conversations to be factual or inspirational? And I think some of those areas are some of the ways that you may be able to protect some of the users from some of those types of behavior.
Absolutely. I mean, a very good point, well made. Anyone else with thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just like to kind of build on what Sarah said earlier. So I think one of the, there's a lot of positive things that we've seen through the increasing digital interactions across the past couple of years of the pandemic. But of course, there's always a darker side to that phenomenon as well. So what we've seen based on the research that we've done is that, there's been a lot of increased connectivity. There's a lot of a new dimension of psychological disorders that we can see kind of coming from stress and anxiety. And it's always a kind of for us, we've kind of seen how that's been balanced against our everyday lives. But going back to the point of how, youths today, especially in the youngest percentile, have grown up amidst digital first worlds, a lot of digital touch points. You can even say that, there's, the main part of the lives are spent online in comparison to actually having more that kind of physical. So you're not even thinking about the blending of the physical and digital, but focusing on digital as well. So this is one of the kind of aspects that we really wanted to kind of look at the survey. And just building off on what Sarah said about platforms also have the responsibility to kind of filter fake news and guarding against negative sort of postings that affect use in a certain way. But one thing that we've discovered in the survey, which extends not just on online activity, but also in terms of how youth look at the economics and governance as well, right? There's still a lot of kind of how would you say, reliance on governments to kind of steer their direction forward. So a lot of the youth in the region that we've surveyed in the study actually wanted to put that onus on governments right now, but only a few respondents, respondents in very few countries across the region can actually safely say that the governments are actually doing taken the right steps to safeguard themselves against online harassment. So based on our findings, we can only see at Singapore at 45%, Indonesia at 51%, and Vietnam at 46% can confidently state that the local internet laws are actually helping to safeguard youth against online bullying. So in contrast, we can see that there's actually more ambivalence in Malaysia, which are 40%, and Thailand at 43%, whereas those in the Philippines at 42% and Cambodia at 43% are actually more concerned and do not really see that the internet laws actually help against this phenomenon occurring.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see the differences just within the region of how much everyone relies on their governments to regulate something like fake news and online harassment, and how that changes depending on which governments are in charge in which countries. Is there any other? I just wanted to ask if anybody else wanted to make a point on this before I move on to the next question.
Yeah, I think I always have a lot to say about this topic. I think it comes down to one question: is who's going to be the arbiter of truth online? Should it be social media platforms? Should it be governments? Or should individuals be held responsible for the content that they're putting up on these different platforms? We've already talked about, and we've seen the effect that unmoderated content can have. We've seen it in Myanmar. We've seen the Capitol insurrection in Washington D.C. We've seen many other examples. But I think it comes down to two things: is who do you trust to moderate that content and to make those decisions for you? Do you trust governments? We've seen in the past there have been authoritarian governments who have cracked down on speech, and that obviously has many negative effects. We've seen in the last few years social media platforms not have the capabilities or have the motivation or even sort of the resources to put in that the requisite amount of money, which is a tremendous amount of resources and money, to go into moderating content at scale with the local language, with doing it in local languages, doing it across markets. So the question really is, who do you trust in doing that? I think the findings, Imran, showed that the findings in Imran show that it's split between who the youth actually trust in making that decision. But my perspective is that we're at this point now where there's very little meaningful distinction between online and offline spaces, and I think the last couple of years of sort of the pandemic have really exacerbated that as well. So my question is, why can't social media companies now be held accountable in the same accountable and responsible in the same ways that public utility providers are? There's many arguments that the internet is a public utility, and social media platforms are like that as well. So regulations and laws have to evolve and have to look at that and have to really sort of catch up to how the industry and how we communicate, and especially how the young communicate, has moved on, so we can build healthier digital communities. But the question again, and if they refuse to step up, or if they don't, and if you look at what's been happening with Elon Musk and what he's been saying with Twitter, is that we're going back to free speech and no more content moderation. So the question is, who will, right? And there's only one real answer, and my bet's on governments. There are many pros and cons with that. It really depends on what the government's intentions are, on what they're trying to achieve. Are they really just going to be that body that regulates without sort of interfering, or are they going to go and only allow one perspective to come in? And that's going to be the big question. But I think this is the most important topic for that we're going to see with regards to the internet for the next sort of 20 years. It's going to be exacerbated if all these metaverse dreams and then sort of the metaverse vision comes in. It's just going to be exacerbated, and I don't think we have an answer. And honestly, 20 years from now, if we're having this conversation, I don't think we'll have an answer then as well.
Well, that's a tough one, because we were hoping to get some of the answers in this hour-long session. You bring up some really great points there. Who mediates it? Who do you trust? You brought up Twitter, and of course, all the online social media companies are now having to regulate people like Donald Trump, who perhaps don't always tell the truth. So really, ultimately, who does it come down to? Who does it come down to in terms of monitoring what's out there? Is it really, the end consumer? Is it the media channels? Is it government? It's so hard to say. I mean, I guess if you had a choice in the world, what would it be? Who would you prefer to monitor this online content? Who would be the ideal person to do this, or organization to do this? Anyone have a particular preference?
If I can just add, so I don't have like an ideal solution. I don't think, at the same time, I don't think that there should be one arbiter of truth. I don't think that that power should be owned by just the one party. And again, it sounds ideal, but I think it should be a democratized and a collaborative process between all parties, whether it's the consumer or government. The process should definitely be regulated, in my opinion. And I think it should start with a foundation of educating everyone along this sort of, if we can call it like this supply chain, I guess, because media literacy is not something, at least in Southeast Asia, I'm aware that people are not too familiar with it. My parents, for example, they get majority of the news on the WhatsApp auntie chains, and that's not always very healthy for them. And they've got a journalist as a daughter, and even then I'm struggling to sort of like educate them on things like, where are you getting your news from? How are you sourcing? Is it credible? And also to build on Pranav's point before about youth being empowered on social media, I think one great thing about especially social media is that the playing field has sort of been leveled because of high penetration of social media and also of mobile users in the region. And I think we've moved past that sort of old guard of journalism where debate and intellectual thought is usually reserved for the Ivy Leagues or the elites. And I would love to see this whole process, this whole regulation process just become much more democratized.
Yeah, no, very good point. Very difficult to do as well, I'm sure, as many governments and social media companies and consumers and media companies can attest to. How do you do it, and how do you do it effectively? It's interesting because obviously the lockdown has exacerbated a lot of this. We know digital interaction in Southeast Asia has exploded during these pandemic-induced lockdowns. And the survey results, which Imran and Pranav have mentioned, not only reflect this growing trend between youth, but also how youths are now more engaged than ever on socio-political discourse via online channels. So, the interesting way of how to reach out to them and do it effectively is something that is so hard to define. So how would each of you choose to do this? When you're putting out a piece of communication, for instance, how do you define it so that it is appealing to the youth?
I can jump in first. Yeah. I think maybe one thing for us to be thinking about is, someone mentioned a little earlier, it needs to be relevant. And although that's true and that's important, I think we need to start allowing our youth to be part of the process versus it just being one way, and actually make it two-way, because that's actually where we're going to see more engagement from our youth. So to sort of answer your question, I guess that's somewhat of a segue to my response, which is collaboration with them. And I think our media platforms need to be building opportunities that give them the opportunity to have a voice. We actually did some more research. LinkedIn loves research. We did some more research called betas, and that research showed us that one of the most important things in terms of this age segment is that our respondents also that they need to have an identity. They've been raised in an era where personal brands intersect with their profession. So they consider themselves trendsetters. They're really highly focused on their careers. They want to stay self-important. They want to stay abreast of innovation trends. They like to generate their own content. And we've seen that through the way that we've seen the explosion of things like TikTok, and they want to optimize the way that they're using a lot of these platforms for their workplace. So I think we do need to think about how we're working with them and actually making them part of the process to a degree. I'll give you a good example at LinkedIn. we now have the ability for professionals to turn on creator mode within their profile. So it means they are indicating to their network and beyond that, that their profile is a source for inspiring content. So it gives them the chance to create conversations that matter with like-minded individuals and co-create with other content creators. And so I think working through solutions and tools like that might allow us to help engage these youth and make it a little more two-way.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, just how media companies, social media companies and others are adapting to try to engage with youth. Again, this is something I suppose many of us amongst the panel who've been in the industry can understand, just how the industry, the media industry, is changing and transforming in order to appeal to this next generation of news consumer. I certainly can speak from my perspective, having worked with the BBC for 18 years, that it had started to transform just over the many years I was there. Towards the end, it was about those digi videos, those packages, those news packages that were short, snappy, and made things very ingestible very quickly. And certainly I saw that happening in an organization like the BBC, but I'm curious to know if anybody else has seen it happening within their organizations, this ability to transform, to reach out to this new consumer who wants things in a very bite-sized way and in a very immediate way. And I suppose I should ask the journalists amongst you. So Sureka and Balji, have you seen that happen within your sectors?
Unfortunately, I have not. Let's say, as an example, let me take an example. If I were editing a newspaper today or running a TV station today, how would I treat the war in Ukraine for a young audience? And I would say that you have to make the Ukraine war, make it very personal for the young person. In the sense, as an example, in the sense that if your country is attacked by a big neighbor, what do you think will happen? I mean, bringing it down to that level, If you start talking to the young about Putin and all the problems that he has been having, he's now trying to rebuild his empire, I think it will be lost on the young people. So you have to bring it down to a certain level, to the reader's level, to the level of the youth. My own view is that I think many, from what I've seen of newspapers and TV stations and radio stations, either they are reluctant to do it, or they don't know how to do it, or they haven't even thought about doing it. So the critical word for me is, how do you make it relevant for your youth audience?
Absolutely. Sureka.
If I can just jump in. So I think that definitely Balji makes some good points about relevance, but also I think that, we don't necessarily have to be bending over backwards to sort of appeal to a millennial or Gen Z audience all the time. I think that, so I'm Malaysian, and, there are lots of social injustices in my country. And I find that, when I'm on the streets, whether it's a protest or whether it's the front lines of both, like in a physical and also an online media sense, I feel like it's primarily made up of youth and young people. I find that they're the one who are most sort of fiery about a lot of these issues. They don't necessarily need to look at it always from a personal perspective. I think they get that these issues are, there are injustices in the world, and that if they don't speak up, it's going to get sort of swept under the carpet. And also, I think, trying to sort of uplift marginalized voices, etc. But that being said, I also think that we, as from an editor's point of view, I think that we're definitely starting to think more about formats like short form content. It is an attention economy, and there's a sort of, to put it crudely, like a war for eyeballs. And, especially with the proliferation of TikTok, Reels, content is sort of being reimagined. Of course, there are pros and cons to this. And I think one downside in the battle for attention is that people sometimes bypass facts. The internet is becoming more and more polarizing. Sometimes, as Pranav mentioned before, dangerous sort of ideologies can appear as a result of this. And I guess that just ties back to all publishers having due diligence and making sure content moderation is in place. But yeah, I don't think that we should be thinking. Sometimes we do tend to overthink. Like, not everything has to be presented in a sort of choreographed TikTok video. I think that going back to my earlier point, we do underestimate, I think, the way youths understand and comprehend social issues.
That's a great point. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I'll just make one quick point. One of the findings was that I think this goes back to the education point that I think Balji brought up earlier. Is that one of the findings was that the youth across most of the of the markets and of the countries in Southeast Asia said that they would like to see more done to actually help them learn how to better determine accurate news. So whether it's governments or external bodies giving them more information so that they can spot the difference between fake news and sort of I guess the truth. So that's one thing that was really backed up by a study as well. But I think the key thing to take away from all of this is that it really goes back to a few of the points that everyone made. Is we shouldn't be looking to mold youth voices, but we should be looking to give them a platform to express their voices in a safe way, which means they shouldn't be a ton of backlash for taking a stand. They should be able to safely make a point and have some sort of have that ability to do that. And it's really about learning from them. It's learning how they want to communicate, how they want to be engaged, how they consume information, and then going about and engaging with them constantly and consistently and regularly. I think where a lot of people, and this is across from governments to brands to individuals, where they kind of drop off is that they don't take that time to understand how the youth want to be communicated to, how they want to be engaged. And then when they do, if they do, they only do it in really short spurts. So it might be right before an election. Let's find out what the youth want, what the youth vote is, or what issues are there for them. And then once the election's over, they don't really prioritize those issues as well, because they may not be the biggest vote bank. So I think that's one of the biggest issues, and that's where I think policies and just broader views and strategies need to change. And until that happens, I think we'll be having a lot of these conversations over and over until you really see that change happening.
Yeah, I'm conscious of the fact that we're having all these great conversations, making very valid points, but no one's asked a question yet. So please, anyone out there watching, you've got about 10 minutes left in the session. So this is your chance to ask your burning questions to our panelists, our panel of experts who'll be able to address some of these issues that we've been talking about. So please go ahead and put your question in the chat. We would love to hear from you before we go. But I guess, moving on to, we've talked a little bit about, who needs to regulate the news, who needs to be able to tell the truth, who needs to be able to, whether it comes down to educators, the media channels themselves, social media, et cetera, et cetera. But it's interesting, we talked about the pandemic and the influence it's had on the consumption of news and social media. Do you think youth today are more impressionable than previous generations simply because they have access to so much out there, so much information? Are they more impressionable? What would you say were some of the results from this survey? And also just curious to know what else you guys are seeing in terms of how you've engaged with the youth and whether they are perhaps more impressionable.
I think definitely yes, but I think where the difference is that they're impressionable, but then they're also very educated and knowledgeable about certain topics. And again, like I said earlier, they're willing to take a stand and to actually have a viewpoint. And if they see apparent injustice, or if they see that there are policies being put forward that they disagree with, they are willing to take that conversation forward and actually bring it up and actually take action on that, right? And not just sort of tweet about it. They actually sort of go forward and gather public support and so on and so forth. What's interesting is that this actually, like the study found that this actually changes depending on the topic. So we actually looked at 3 different topics. We looked at active citizenship and social advocacy. We looked at like public engagement and gender inclusion, and we looked at race and minority group issues. And actually the findings change depending on the issue as well. So I think it's really interesting to see that there are certain issues that the youth feel that they have like a larger voice or a voice that is heard a little bit more on certain topics, and they have the ability to take a stand on those. And then there are some where they actually feel they actually don't have that ability. And I think, for example, I'll give you a quick example. In Thailand, 72% thought that they did not, like there was a poor opportunity to be able to comment or participate in terms of social advocacy or active citizenship. But if you look at the other categories that I mentioned, the other issues that I mentioned, that number is about 50%. So there's a huge change between them, between the different types of issues. And I think if you think about the political situation in Thailand, you can understand why. So it was very interesting to see that certain issues, people feel more empowered to take a stand on. And I think that also depends on, the other broader cultural norms and things that are taking place in the different countries in Southeast Asia, and maybe the broader global conversation around those issues. So that was an interesting finding, and it'll be interesting to see how that changes, because especially topics like gender inclusion and race and minority group issues have really evolved in terms of the conversation and accelerated in the last couple of years. So I'd be really curious to see, 2-3 years down the line, how that compares to where things are now. And I hope that more people feel empowered, that they're able to comment and participate in those conversations, a couple of years down the line.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is that something that any of you are seeing as well? This development. And yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, I put the question out to this group. We've all just said that we're under the age limit of youth, and I'm put myself in there too by about maybe 6 weeks, and then I'm over it, unfortunately. But are we impressionable? I asked us the question. We are part of this segment, so yeah, thought I'd just mention that.
That's a very good point. Once again, we've got 5 minutes left to this session. I'd love to hear questions. I believe we do have one from Wei Yi Chu, a question asking, how do we make the social media space online safer for civic discussions, which I guess we talked about a little bit earlier about online harassment, etc., etc. What are some ways we can get people to take a stand yet remain open to different perspectives? A great question, Wei Yi. Thank you for that. And anyone want to take that? I know we've answered a little bit of it, but perhaps not all of it. Who'd like to take that question from Wei Yi? So the question is, how can we take a stand to remain open to different perspectives? And that's a tough one. It is a tough one.
It is a tough one. And look, my recommendation would be, as this is a starting point, go to a platform where those conversations are respected and allowed, and where you find that you can have transparency and openness. I'd say that's the first starting point, perhaps, as someone who's interested in maybe having those conversations.
I would add a couple of other things. I would say first, have them with the people around you, have them with your friends, have them with your family, have them with your peers. And I think that's the best way to build knowledge and information about certain topics. And then, look them up and be informed, inform yourself first. There's tons of resources, inform yourself first before, and just be careful about engaging online, because there's always going to be, keyboard warriors. If anyone who's a football fan will see after any football match the abuse that footballers get and that the teams get. So just be wary of that. Try to do them in safer spaces first, with friends and family. I know that doesn't really answer the question, because the question is, how can the social platforms do that? But I guess my broader answer is that, majority of them, and I'm saying the majority of them because Sarah is also on this call, and I do believe LinkedIn is separate from all of the other ones. That's my personal opinion. I do believe that majority of them cannot do that and cannot consistently create safe spaces. Yeah, so a very negative answer to ways. Sorry about that, but that's just my personal opinion on that.
Well, in that case, we have about 2 minutes left in this session. Some great questions there. One more here from Karen Chan. In fact, I will just put this question through before we wrap up. Is just dropping one in, even though perhaps we don't have to cater specifically to the youth in trying to get them to care about the news, what would be suggestions for engaging them in current affairs without oversimplification through various social media? So Karen, great question there. How do we do that? How do we engage them without oversimplifying things?
I'd like to kind of comment on that just a bit quickly. So I think we discussed this quite a bit earlier, but I think, yeah, oversimplification, when it's kind of been done by an organization, it's like, it makes a relationship very transactional. So as I think Pranav mentioned before, there are a lot of things coming out, especially during elections. It's like, there's always a communication going out, there are rallies going out and looking at these voices, but how does it actually translate to things afterwards? And it goes back to like what I mentioned about certain wings of party, youth wings of parties are actually way beyond the age limit. So they are not really actually cognizant of what's really happening on the ground. But I think having that two-way communication, as to what Sarah mentioned earlier, is important, is because we need to get the youth engaged. We need to have that buy-in that's more organic, not just targeted during certain kind of like events that's happening as well. And just based on our study, what we've done is that, we actually see that youth actually are aware that their opinions can be colored by social media. So sometimes there can be an element of like, we're not giving them enough due respect as to how it's learned, because they have to understand that younger generations, they've had access to many more different forms of multimedia, so more than any other generation previously. So when they actually trawl through, it becomes more of a digital native thing. They see that first, beyond us looking at books, things are happening live and within seconds, updated daily as well. So there's a lot of information that's flowing over that they have more eyeballs looking at it rather than just reacting to certain things. So when it comes down to this, the fact of like how they can actually distinguish between facts and opinion, social media as well, especially when it comes to us catering to it as well. I think we just need to give them a bit more due credit, because when we want to say that impressionable, we've been impressionable before. We've been used before as well. The fact of it is that the information that we've got in previous sources, they've been more not just structured in a sense, but there were certain kind of like platforms, whether it's traditional print, TV and all that was filtered, but that filter is becoming less controllable nowadays. So it's just a fact that, we have to understand that there's more information overload. That's a bigger risk with them compared to like us or any previous generations.
No, thank you for that. And just one observation, actually, I should mention, I'm in the UK at the moment, and over here, I'm not necessarily saying it's the right way to go about it, but there is a new news outlet that is about to launch called the News Movement. And in fact, it's got some very powerful media people behind it, one of whom was the editorial director of the BBC, former editorial director of the BBC, Kamal Ahmed, and the person who ran Dow Jones, Will Lewis. They've started the News Movement, which is really to appeal to the youth, because essentially the news is going out. The pieces that they're producing is entirely going out on things like TikTok. And I believe it was Balji who mentioned how to explain the Ukraine war to the youth. Well, the News Movement has done this through TikTok. So go and have a look and tell me what you think about how they are trying to appeal to the youth, because they're not doing it the traditional ways. If you Google News Movement, you come onto their website, which is really short, really colorful, and really just stating the fact that they are reaching out to a young audience through very short little clips and snippets, and through TikTok and various other mediums that they know the youth go to. So this is one example of one organization that is doing it. I'm not necessarily saying they're a successful example, they haven't fully launched yet, but it is one example of what's happening here in the West. So perhaps this is something that may happen soon in Southeast Asia as well. Anyone else with any more thoughts on how to appeal to the youth in terms of, depicting the news a certain way or going through different channels? Because there's another quick question here, if I can move on to it. I realize we're up on the hour, but there's a question here from Anonymous. Are there any insights specific to Southeast Asia's youth that can be shared? What is the most preferred digital platform for this target audience? So I know we mentioned TikTok a lot, but what other digital platforms are there? And obviously, Sarah, I'm conscious of the fact that you're from LinkedIn, which does have the creator mode, so you do reach out to the youth as well. Are there specific digital platforms, do you think, that are more appealing?
I wouldn't necessarily be able to comment on that specifically, but what I can say is that out of the 78 million global members we have on LinkedIn, 27 million of them are Gen Z professionals in APAC. And about 15% of them sit within the Southeast Asian market. So I'll maybe leave it at those statistics, but what I would say is that we're seeing, quite a substantial amount of the Gen Z coming through on the platform because of the value it's giving them in terms of their careers moving forward. So that's it, and they're also using it for things like content and news and updates and things like that. So I can share that.
Yeah. 27 million, quite a staggering number indeed. Great. Well, I think we are up almost on the timing, and thank you all for some of those great questions that have come through. I will ask just a quick 30-second sum up from each of our panelists. We've been talking for an hour about the future of media and communications. Is the industry, do you think, set to transform further because of the kinds of influence the youth have had, as well as technology? Let's not forget, it's played a crucial role as well. And are you optimistic about this transformation? So a quick 30-second sum up from each of you on the future of communications. How do you think it's going to evolve further, and due to the influence of youth and technology? Who wants to start first? Sarah, we're looking at you, so why don't you start?
Sure, I think someone was going to jump in, but no drama. I would say for me, really, I'm absolutely optimistic about what's to come. I think I mentioned this already in that I really see creation, co-creation, that creator mentality being the key to unlocking further potential in the space, quite honestly.
Thank you. So an optimistic note to end on. Anyone else?
Actually, sorry.
Sorry, you go, Imran.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think someone else said something before, so at the risk of repeating, I think youths are guided by a strong set of principles. And we have enough evidence now that the Gen Z community, they're aware about some of these issues like sustainability and DEI. And I think so much of their consumption behavior is guided by these principles. And so I think because of that, I'm very optimistic at what the youth are demanding and what the youth are, how the youth are holding media accountable. And also, to repeat what Sarah said, creativity of content, the creator sort of mentality, and the democratization of media are all things that have me very excited.
Excellent. Nice note of optimism there too. Imran, you were going to jump in.
Thanks, Ranjit. Yeah, I just want to kind of build off on that. I think one of the things that will be interesting to see over the next few decades that's actually more specific to Southeast Asia. So I think when it comes to how youth-led movements have actually influenced politics, socio-political kind of systems in the past, it's not been done or not visible here as much. So actually over the past couple of years, we've actually seen that youth actually become more engaged than ever in this sort of social-political discourse through online channels, and taking cues from what's been happening in other regions of the world on how they can actually mobilize their civic activism more digitally. So one of the things, interesting trends is that, take for example, what happened in Thailand recently. Just last year, we always see that certain political agendas parties may influence certain movements, but in Thailand it was predominantly university-led. So there was actually not a lot. We can't say what happens behind the scenes, but most of them did not identify with any political party. They just wanted to have the issues known about certain things happening in the country that they would like to actually resolve. And it's kind of interesting to see if that will kind of start taking root across the region as well. But overall, I think it's still kind of a new uncharted area. So our region, Southeast Asia over here, after the pandemic, we are still living in a a world with high uncertainty as well. So, the youth today need to face a new reality, that's different compared to previous generations. There are fewer precedents for them to lean on, to take cues from as well. So in a sense, they're looking for a brighter tomorrow, but they are quite conscious that they will need to be the ones setting the directions for the generations that will come afterwards.
All right, thank you, Imran. I did say 30 seconds, but that's okay. You did give us a good sum up there. Now, Balji, we haven't heard from you very much, but as the oldest member of the panel and the one with the most experience, where do you see this evolution of communications and media going? And as somebody who's obviously been in the industry for a long time, are you optimistic about the transformation?
I am not that optimistic.
Why not?
Because, okay, good. Of course, I have the answer for that. And I feel that the fact that I worked with the media for a long time, and I've seen how media reacts, I don't think, firstly, they have the people who understand the need for what to do. I don't think they have an idea. So that's, I want to come to the second point, which I think is a more important point from my perspective, and that is we cannot leave this to the media alone. There are many people out there in the community, whether they are teachers, whether they are parents, whether they are friends, all these are people who can shape the way the young think. Now, how to get these people to do what we feel they should do, that's a Herculean task. Maybe I should leave it like that, and we all can think about it, and maybe we can meet again 1 year's time and see see whether that's possible or not. So my main message, my main point is, don't leave it to the media alone. They can't do it on their own.
All right, very good point to leave it on. And Pranav, I guess you get the last word. Where do you see the media and communications sector going in terms of how it's likely to transform because of the influence from the youth and technology?
Yeah, I think really just echo some of the points made before. I'm very optimistic about the role the youth will have and the increased voice they will have by leveraging media, leveraging social platforms and things like that. Where I'm not optimistic is how much the role of the social platforms in providing and being the source of fair and honest information. I think that's the area where I see the biggest gap. But in terms of, if there's a generation who can get around that and who can leverage the good of social platforms and who can leverage, all these sort of the education and the information that they have already to take a better stand and to make positive change, it is this generation. And it is, the people sort of younger than at least me who are coming up and who are living this digital era. I really think that this is a generation who's going to make tremendous social change for all of us. So very optimistic on that front.
Well, thank you once again to our wonderful panelists. It's been a really interesting, more than an hour-long session with all of you now. And thank you for your time, your insights, your expertise. Thank you also to PRCA for co-hosting this session. And of course, to all of you who are watching and your great questions as well to our panelists. This was a session that was really looking at the future for the industry, this idea of having a youth-led media evolution. Will we ever get there? Will the industry transform to become a better, more regulated one? Lots of questions to be left with, and I hope we managed to answer some of them for you. Thank you all, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you. Goodbye.